All right, so now let's look at Luke 7 example and think about the same beginning, middle, and end plot structure, setting, rising tension, climax, resolution, and following actions. So again, I don't know if we need to read through this story again since you become familiar with it. And so as we think through though the tension of the story, just think about where you would start the tension in this story. All right, you got Jesus entering into the Simon the Pharisee's house. Again, is that tension? Well, maybe, but that's not necessarily the tension that's going to be resolved in the story. That's not what this story is all about. Jesus, dining with this Pharisee. But where does the tension then start that drives the rest of the story? I would say that tension starts in verse 37 with the woman of the city, sinner, coming into the picture. Okay, that which means that verse 36 is our setting. So he's at the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. They're having dinner. Okay, and again, at this point, because there's no tension, the story could have gone any number of directions. And they had a pleasant meal, and Simon asked all kinds of great questions of Jesus, and then they had dessert, and then Jesus left. Well, it doesn't make a great story really because there's no tension. But at this point, the story could have gone anywhere. But now in verse 37, with the introduction of this woman, now the story begins to take shape. The woman comes in and she, worships Jesus by showing him all this hospitality that Simon the Pharisee should have shown. And now the tension begins to get a little bit more ramped up when Simon says to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him, for she is a sinner. So Simon in his mind now is indicting Jesus. Jesus answers him and says, I have something to say to you, Simon. Say it, teacher. And he begins to tell this story, this very brief parable in the middle of the story. Okay? So the tension is beginning to increase. But I would say then it reaches a climax when it says in verse 44, then, turning toward the woman, he said to Simon. So he's speaking to Simon, but he's looking at the woman. He said, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet. So again, imagine the tension. Imagine if you're a disciple. Imagine if you are an onlooker. And now you are turning this indictment back onto Simon. Okay? Instead of honoring Simon in his own house, Jesus begins to indict him because of his love for this woman. Okay? And so he says, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. What's crazy about this is that all the way up to verse 47, we're beginning to wonder, is he really going to honor her? Is he going to forgive her great debt, like the parable talked about? And there's this sense of growing almost angst. Is that that Simon is he's the one that's gonna miss out. He's the one that loves very little. He's the one that's, doesn't receive forgiveness. But this woman then, on the other hand, verse 47 does. And that's where, again, this turning point happens in the story with this declaration in verse 47. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he was forgiven little, loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. So this whole 47 and 48, it seems, is the major turning point and resolution in this story. And then in verse 49 is the following action. Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And so then we have the rest of the story. We have two characters, so to speak, in these last two verses in the following action. The people who are at the table, and then the woman who goes and has experienced peace. So she came in distraught, overwhelmed, probably with her head down and with shame, and here she is now leaving in peace. And then I think what Luke is doing as well here is that he is putting us, or the reader, into the position of those that were sitting at the table, and they began to say, "Who is this?" He's almost as if the narrator is saying to his original audience, "Who do you say he is? Who do you make him out to be? Is he the only one as God who can forgive sins?" This woman got it. Will you? And so, again, though, the point of this story is centered around this climax, turning point, resolution section where you have the narrator, in this case Luke, focusing our attention on this forgiveness, and also I would say on this question of identity, because if he did truly forgive her, only God can forgive sins. So it's also a question of identity, which Simon raises earlier when he says, if this man knew who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him. And so this is a question around forgiveness. It's a question around identity. I think that's where Luke is trying to point our eyes. And so in the next video, then, we're going to now look again, or we're going to look at epistles. And how are epistles structured, and what are some of the things that we can look at to be able to determine what the author was seeking to emphasize in epistles.